In which case, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Dr. Nir Bombs, and it's very good to join you and some of the esteemed colleagues here to this panel, The Future of the JCPOA and the Impact on Iran's Regional Calculus. Of course, a timely issue, an ever-changing issue, and putting the latest development that we have, including in the Ukrainian front. It seems that the Iranian front is still very active. We have an hour with a very esteemed colleagues here on this panel. And what we will do, I will start with a number of questions to kick us off. But you're more than welcome to at the second part of it. For those of you who wish to ask a question, raise your virtual hand or just note it on the chat, and we'll do the best to address it. Thank you for all of you for joining us, and thank you for your interest. And let me perhaps start with you, Mark Dubowitz. You are the CEO of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. You have co-founded FDD's Center on Economic and Financial Power. You wrote and you spoke on the Iran issue a fair bit. And you were an author of more than 20 studies on the issue of the economic sanctions. You're also the co-chair of the project in U.S. Middle East non-proliferation. And I wonder if you can start us off by giving us the status of the JCPOA, particularly with last developments and perhaps the turn in the negotiation. Is this, following the recent Russian position, is this still the joint comprehensive plan of action? And is this still going to be a deal, as we have at least heard in the last weeks leading to the yet another end of these negotiations?
Great. Well, Nir, thanks so much, and it's a real pleasure to be on this Zoom call with Ambassador Ross and with Amjad. And also, just to let everybody know, I mean, I take this issue very personally. I've been working on it for 20 years. Was sanctioned by Iran back in 2019, threatened by Iran. So, as from my perspective, the Islamic Republic of Iran remains one of the most deadly and brutal regimes in the world. And what's happening in Vienna, just to make it clear, I oppose this nuclear agreement that's emerging. But let me put that aside for a second, my own personal opinion, and give some assessment of what is happening in Vienna. I think we were heading to an agreement. Everybody thought that an agreement was imminent. And then the Russian foreign minister kind of threw a bomb into the middle of the negotiations and demanded that the United States and the Europeans give assurances that there'll be no sanctions that will impact bilateral Russian-Iranian trade. And that's not just on the nuclear civil cooperation side, where there's been a fair amount of Russian assistance to Iran, some of it actually quite useful, but broader trade, broader commercial trade as well. The Russians are kind of expecting and anticipating that once the sanctions are lifted and the arms embargo has been lifted last year, the missile embargo is to be lifted next year. As part of this agreement, they can sell billions of dollars worth of advanced weaponry, fighter jets and attack helicopters and battle tanks and submarines to the Iranian military, as well as parts and components so that Iran can expand and extend its long-range missile program, including developing intercontinental ballistic missiles that would target the United States. So the Russian demands are unacceptable. They were rejected by the E3 and U.S. negotiators, rightly so. But it does give you a sense that the Russians still retain enormous leverage in these negotiations. Putin's man in Vienna, Ambassador Ulyanov, has really been the dominant force in these negotiations, kind of brokering the deal between the U.S. and Iran. And still, Putin sees an opportunity to use Vienna and flip Vienna against the United States and the E3, given what's happened in Ukraine and the enormous sanctions pressure that Russia is under.
So perhaps with this, Ambassador Ross, let me turn to you. Of course, Ambassador Dennis Ross, a scholar and diplomat, 3 decades of experience in Middle East policy, working with a number of secretaries of states and presidents since President Clinton and beforehand, also with some experience with the Soviet Union, which becomes now relevant again, looking at what is happening in Russia. Of course, director of the State Department policy planning stuff, also with the Bush administration. Could you speak a little bit about how you understand the calculus on both ends? First of all, what is the Iranian calculus, the way you see it? Do you agree with what Mark just began to articulate? And as somebody who's spent quite some time in the administrations and democratic administrations, how would you describe President Biden's calculus here?
But I think what Mark described in terms of what was happening in Vienna is quite accurate. I think we were actually literally on the brink of an announcement that there had been a deal reached, and then the Russians decided they would try to create a carve-out, since they're now facing sanctions that are actually more severe than the sanctions that the Iranians are facing. I don't think it left the Iranians very happy. We've seen some signs of that. We saw their foreign minister make a statement that could only be interpreted as suggesting that they pursued their own ends in terms of their own interests, and no one else was going to define that for them. I think that what that reflects is that this deal is very much in Iran's interest. And they know it's very much in their interest. They negotiated in a way where they built the pressure on us and the others by advancing their nuclear program. And they were in no hurry. And I think they reached the conclusion, okay, we've gotten about as much as we're going to get. Now I think they actually want the sanctions relieved. So the Russians actually have kind of, as we say, thrown a spoke in the wheel. And whether or not that's going to mean there won't be a deal, I'm dubious. I think there actually will still be a deal because I think the Iranians want it. And ultimately, I think that's always been kind of the arbiter of whether or not there was going to be a return to the JCPOA. But it was clearly going to be done on their schedule and based on them having created pressure. Now, what is the calculus of the administration? I think there's several elements. Element number one is they look at what the Iranians have done and they want to stop the program where it is. They're enriching to 60%. They have, according to the IEA, basically a bomb's worth of enriched material to 60%, which is extremely close to weapons grade. They have been producing uranium metal, which has no justifiable civilian purpose. Either does enrichment to 60%. So these both not only get stopped from the administration standpoint, they get, the 60% gets rolled out, gets shipped out of the country, ironically, to the Russians. The 20% enrichment gets shipped out to the Russians. The excess, they have about 10 times the amount of enriched uranium on hand now than they're entitled to have under the terms of the JCPOA. That gets shipped out. I think from the administration standpoint, they're stopping the program. And why is it so important for them to stop the program? Because I think they fear that if there is no deal now, and the Iranians in these circumstances then actually go ahead and do 90%, and they might do it just to show, all right, here's the consequences of not having done the deal that we wanted. The administration fears, well, we have to do something then. If they get 90% and the IAEA is not in there in the way it normally would be, and they're able to hide it, divert it, suddenly you have this diverted in all sorts of secret places within Iran. I think the administration fears it would be driven to have to do something even militarily. And I think that's kind of the last thing it has wanted to do. Although I want to say, it's not clear to me how much the current reality with the Russians in Ukraine is going to affect the administration's approach to the Middle East. There's no question when it came in, the Middle East, you wouldn't have put it on its top 10 priorities. One of the ironies is the Iranians made a decision they were going to force themselves onto the Biden administration agenda. And effectively they did. So is this administration now, with what has clearly been a wake-up call? We've seen an unbelievable transformation in Europe. And I think that there's an important question. Does the calculus of the administration change now? And does the president conclude we need to show a tougher face towards the region? And not just symbolically. It's going to have to be backed by actions that make any tough words seem credible. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's at least thinking about, because I think there is some real potential for this. That doesn't change, I think, their basic desire to stop the Iranian program. And I'll just add one more point. I think that still begs an important question. Even if you accept everything at face value that I think the administration wants in terms of stopping the program and buying time, the question one has to ask is, well, what is the administration intending to do with that time? We know that the Obama administration pretty much turned a blind eye to what the Iranians were doing in the region. We know that if the Iranians are getting sanctions relief, which is clearly, I think, a major concern of probably everybody who's part of this event, if they can cause the kind of trouble they've been causing in the region without sanctions relief, we can only imagine how much more they can do with it. I think a real question to be asking the administration, and I think they themselves are aware of it, is, okay, if in fact we have stopped the nuclear program, but they're ratcheting up and doing much more in the region, what's the administration going to do about that? What's it going to do with its partners? How can it counter the Iranians? How does it raise the cost of the Iranians? All that might also be another manifestation of the administration deciding to adopt a posture that shows it's prepared to be tougher in the region and, in a sense, invest more in the region than it clearly wanted to when it came in.
And I think we're going to kind of get back to some of these points soon. The change in calculus, the relationships to the reality in Ukraine, and also I believe the question that you posed to the administration, to the U.S. administration, that is need to reassess some policies because perhaps some of the reality now is changing, and perhaps it's a time to pay a bit more attention to what is happening outside the U.S. borders, as if not, then other players may be doing much more than perhaps anticipated. But let's jump back to the region. And Amjad, let me now ask you. You are a Bahrain-based regional director of the British Middle East Center for Studies and Research. You are the author of The Deception of the Arab Spring. You are advisor to a number of GCC government officials. And being in the Gulf, you're also a neighbor of Iran. How all of this looks from you, for where you sit right now, I believe in Abu Dhabi.
Correct, that's right. Well, thank you for having me, and I hope you hear my voice very clear enough. When it comes to the JCPOA's future and its impact on Iran and the region, I think it's quite simple. We can look back at the previous deal and see what happened. It merely delayed Iran's advancement of the nuclear weapons, during which time Iran occupied Iraq with its militias, Iran occupied Yemen with its own terrorist group, the Houthis, and implemented Hezbollah into Syria. $15 billion Obama rewarded to Tehran. They went directly into the pockets of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. And quite far for causing chaos and executing people in the Middle East. The nuclear deal enclosed weaknesses up to this point. At least the agreement make no references to Iran ballistic missiles or Iran's support for terrorism. Iran nuclear deal was unacceptable because Tehran could not be trusted to withhold from developing nuclear weapons in the future. The joint comprehensive plan of actions, the so-called sunset clause, if I may say, quoting the JCPOA, it means that Iran could manufacture a nuclear weapon within weeks. In 8 to 10 years' time, Iran, by that time, at the end of that period, Iran can and has the right to do so, to build that kind of nuclear bomb. By that time, they will kick all the inspectors out, and of course, by the time we get the condemnations are over, they will have one bomb, and by the time resolution is passed, as they will have dozens of bombs, and as we've seen how the world is a bit slow to react to danger. Ukraine is a case that we witnessed, and then we are next door to the Iranians, and it's very different when you're far from the Iranians, being a neighbor of Iran. Since the talk began nearly a year ago, more hardline leadership in Tehran has taken power, and the Gulf has been shaken by a flood of shipping and drones attack. And what did the United States do? They were running to satisfy Iran. This agreement, if made, at least this is, I can tell you from a perspective of many in the region, this agreement, if made, demonstrates at this stage, once again, the United States betrayal to the region. As an illustration of this, if I may say, historically, the UAE, for example, has been a close ally to the United States policy in the Middle East, as evidenced by its role in the Abrahamic Accord, at least, which resulted in an amazing historical decision to establish a diplomatic relationship with Israel and paved the way for others to join, such as Bahrain, Morocco, and so on. And what was the reward for making such a deal with a country that calls? What was the reward for that? It was United States of America going with a deal, dealing with Iran, making a lovely deal for the sake of Iran that says death to America, death to the Jews, death to the Israel, death to the United Kingdom. This is Iranian slogan up to this point. If we cannot change that, then we haven't changed much. While the UAE on the other side and others remains committed to maintaining a strong ties with Washington. The Biden administration ambiguous attitude, at least recently, towards the Gulf region over the last year has promoted the Emiratis and the Saudis and the rest to reconsider its approach since becoming a president. Joe Biden and his team have demonstrated a lack of trustworthiness, at least in Afghanistan. What happened there, it wasn't a great signal so far. We're not getting any good signal up to this point. While Biden administration were in Vienna discussing a nuclear negotiation with Iran on January the 17th, Houthis rebellions, or the Houthis terrorists launched their first and most serious attack targeting Abu Dhabi International Airport and nearby oil storage facilities, resulting in an explosion that killed 3 people and injured another 6. Did Biden administration react similarly in the same way they are reacting right now to Ukraine? Absolutely not. They went on a silent mood, or what we call it here in the region, a flat statement. We condemn. In any case, UAE officials responded and made it even easier for the United States of America, and they responded to the attacks by pleading with Washington to provide the UAE with increased security while also moving the Houthis back to the terrorist list. Houthis, who killed almost 500,000 of the Yemenis and the southern people in Yemen, yet Biden administration believe they do not considered at this stage as a terrorist. The Biden administration was preoccupied with facilitating a deal with Iran. Countries such as UAE are reassessing at this point their geopolitical priorities in the light of this behavior and the fact that United States insisting in completing the JCPOA deal regardless of the consequences. The United States commitment to ensuring the security of its alliance is questioned today. It is big time questioned. The regional countries will seek, and yes, I am sorry to say this at this stage, but wherever you sit with many officials around the region, you will hear the following. We seek the balance for the sake of willing to seek a balance, balancing their relationship with other global powers such as Russia and China, while dealing pragmatically with Iran, because Iran is directly a neighbor with us, and US, through the deal, they could not push Iran into stopping its terrorists. So we have no other choice to pragmatically dealing with Iran. But in the same time, we would not stop Israel from practicing its freedom of action and to respond to Tehran if necessary. Thereby, it's and I'm not gonna take longer than this. Thereby, it's unsurprisingly today to read in the newspapers that the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have declined to schedule a call with the United States President Joe Biden in recent weeks, as he only contacts when he needs additional support. And I will conclude with this. according to Obama, if I may, according to Obama, and following his statement which indicated in 2011 a direct support for Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Once again, according to Obama, MBZ, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ communicated to Obama such a statement, or an action in this case, at least right now, demonstrates that the US was not a long-term partner they could rely on. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Amjad. And I believe that the dynamics you described was very visible even last week in the corridors of the United Nations, when you've seen among the 35 nations that did not vote with the United States on the issue of Ukraine in the first vote, you've seen a number of Arab countries, including the UAE, very much for that reason. And Mark, if I can turn back to you, I believe that some of this tension that has to do not just with the US position vis-a-vis the Middle East, but really with the dangers of the issues that were not addressed at the JCPOA, allowing
Nair, Nair, we can't hear you clear because someone has the mic open.
I can only try that again, and then just hopefully
yes, now it's clear.
Hopefully others can mute. As I was saying, that some of these tensions were visible and probably connected to some of the issues that were not addressed, either at the first or the second JCPOA, when we have an attempt to have a compromise dealing with just the nuclear issues. We're leaving a number of issues aside that enables Iran to have a regional signature and continue to act in a number of arenas, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Lebanon, and whether it's in Syria. Mark, can you address some of these dangers and issues, and whether you think that some of the current dynamics that we see now may perhaps change the calculus or the dealings with the ability to give Iran more of a free hand to continue its belligerency in the region?
Yeah, it's funny. Nair, I was thinking, is there anything that I disagree with my friend Amjad on? And I was really struggling to find anything. I think I wholeheartedly embrace everything he said. I mean, he did, I think, an excellent job of kind of analyzing the risks of both the nuclear deal and the fact that the deal itself does not address Iran's dangerous, destructive, and obviously very malign activity outside the deal. I mean, my deep concern with this deal can be really seen in the rhetoric of the Biden administration. When the Biden administration came into office, they talked about a longer, stronger, and broader deal. There was finally kind of a recognition after 6 years that this agreement was flawed. And we had a big debate with the Obama administration in 2015 about the original JCPOA. At the time, Ben Rhodes, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor of Strategic Communications, said that this deal permanently cut off all pathways to nuclear weapons. Well, clearly it doesn't, because as Amjad said, there are sunset provisions under which all of the key restrictions on the nuclear program go away over time, not to mention restrictions on conventional arms, on missiles, and on some of the mechanisms that are going to be very important with respect to inspections. So the deal clearly didn't permanently cut off all pathways to nuclear weapons, and that was acknowledged, in fairness, by the Biden administration, that said we need a longer, we need a stronger, and we need a broader deal. We need a deal that addresses what Amjad said, or these other elements of Iran malign behavior. Well, that longer and stronger and broader then rhetorically changed to longer and stronger. And now we're at a deal in Vienna, an emerging deal that Dennis mentioned was on the cusp of being signed, which is shorter and weaker. And so the deal is even more problematic than the original 2015 deal. Well, let's take a look at a few of these elements, because I think it's very important for the audience to understand this. The first is that this deal does not put Iran's nuclear program in a box, right? Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, brilliant guy, great practitioner of national security, said that our goal is to put Iran's nuclear program in a box. Unfortunately, the box is not a concrete box. It's more like a jack in the box, because at some point when these restrictions expire, Iran's nuclear program leaps out of the box and it becomes an industrial-sized nuclear program with near zero nuclear breakout and much easier advanced centrifuge-powered clandestine sneak out. Right? Iran itself gets tens of billions of dollars in sanctions relief, which helps to save it from the economic crisis that it faced under the Trump administration, allows it to build up an economy and increasingly fortify itself against our ability to use sanctions in the future. And obviously, as we've talked about repeatedly, it gives billions of dollars for the IRGC and the Quds Force to spread their dangerous and destructive behavior through the region and finance their proxies like Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and Hamas and militias in Iraq and Houthis in Yemen. So the deal, longer, stronger, broader, went to longer and stronger. Now it's shorter and weaker. It doesn't put the program in a box. In fact, it results in a jack in the box. It also results in a Pandora's box, because coming out of the deal, right, are all these really foreseen and very dangerous possibilities, right? Where Iran will use its power, both the threat of nuclear blackmail, which it always sustains and leverages over us, as well as its regional aggression, in order to expand its regional footprint, in order to threaten the UAE and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and Israel and other countries in the region. And it knows, it knows that the Biden administration is going to do very little to push back. Very little to push back because the Biden administration's priorities today are Russia and China. Very little to push back because they've seen that the Biden administration, in the face of nuclear escalation, does not escalate. It tries to de-escalate by offering major concessions. So they know they can wield nuclear blackmail in the form of nuclear escalation over the Biden administration if the Biden administration attempts to use any instruments of American power to push back against Iran in the region, against its missile program, even against its human rights abuses. So I expect that while rhetorically you're going to hear a lot from the Biden administration about what they're going to do outside the deal, I think they're going to do very little meaningfully. And that really leaves Israel as a major force in the Middle East, which I think, to the credit of Barack Obama, because of the JCPOA, he created a set of common interests between Israel and our Arab allies. The Abraham Accords was obviously a major expression of that. I think those ties are deepening. And the Biden administration, and I'll end with this, the Biden administration, I think, is missing an enormous opportunity. And that is to knit together Israel with our Arab allies in a regional security structure that helps us push back against Iran, which means that they do more and we do less as the United States, which I think is very much consistent with our agenda in terms of our pivot out of the Middle East and into the Indo-Pacific. As well, and I think this gets to Amjad's point, as well, it helps counter the hedging strategy that is underway right now in the Gulf and to some extent in Israel, as our Middle Eastern allies see China and Russia pivoting into the Middle East, while the United States appears to be pivoting out. If you knit together that regional security structure, if you start to actually repair relations with the Saudis so that you just don't come to them in a time of crisis begging for more oil, but you've actually had a partnership that works with the Saudis and other Gulf Arabs, then we have a real strategy in the Middle East to counter Iran, and we have a real strategy in the Middle East to counter China and Russia. Otherwise, I fear where our strategy is going, led by this deeply flawed nuclear deal, is to a place where Iran ends up in a lethal end state, where it is not only a grave threat to our allies, but at some point has nuclear-tipped ICBMs that can hold U.S. cities hostage, in which case we now have not only China and Russia to worry about in great power competition, you can add in Iran as a great power adversary as well.
Well, Ambassador Ross, let me see if I can ask you then the following. You have been in some of the rooms in the White House and in the State Department when some of these issues were discussed, previous agreements, and I know you have been also privy to conversations on this particular issue. There are smart people sitting in Washington and in the administrations, the previous administrations and the Biden administration, and I assume that they hear the voices and feel some of these concerns. Can you perhaps provide put us in somebody else's shoes for a second and provide a little bit of a defense or a counter perspective. What do they see that so far we did not articulate? And if you can unmute.
People have tried to do that to me for years, so I've overcome it. Look, I was trying to articulate that a little bit before. Here's what I think their mindset has been, and what I was trying to indicate is we may be at a turning point here. I don't know that we are yet, but we may be. And what I'd like to do is sort of, again, go through what I think their calculus is now, and what I am hoping we may be seeing a pivot towards, a different kind of pivot. So what I was saying before is, and actually Mark made a reference to what Jake had said, they wanted to put the Iran nuclear issue in a box. Now the first thing, and I think their view at the beginning was, we have to stop the advance of the program so that we're not forced to then act against it. And their attitude was, look, it's not just sanctions. At some point, we might actually have to act militarily. The president said they're not going to get a nuclear weapon on my watch. At a different point, when he was actually with Naftali Bennett, he went beyond that. And he said we would prevent them from getting it. So that actually has an implication of action. And the question is, if you don't want to have to act and you have all these other priorities, you want to put it in a box. Now it's a nice objective. For that objective to have any credibility, even with the current deal that is likely to emerge, even with its flaws, for it to have any credibility, the first thing the administration is going to have to do, and I can say I've had this conversation with them. Now, they're hearing me. Now, whether it means they're accepting what I'm saying, I don't know. But I've made the point, look, if you're serious about this, given this deal that you're going to have can best be described as JCPOA minus. As Mark said, it's shorter and lesser. That's why I say it's minus JCPOA. So if you're serious, the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have a strategy of deterrence towards the Iranians on the nuclear issue. Because even if you say the breakout time is going to go down substantially and well before 2030, the Iranians actually don't have a whole lot of incentive to break out at that until 2030, because basically they know that they won't be sanctioned. So the question is, come 2030, when their breakout time will be zero, you're going to have established a policy of deterrence, and you can't do it starting in 2030. You have to do it now. And where do you have to do it? You have to do it in the region. You have to demonstrate that you're prepared to make them pay a price for behaviors that are unacceptable from low to high. That's the way you establish deterrence. Now, to do that, you basically have to say to them, and I'm being told this is where they're coming from, and actually Mark made a reference to, we may hear the rhetoric. So the point is, will we see actions that reflect the rhetoric? I've said you can't, why don't you just take a page from the Iranian playbook? The Iranians say to you, okay, the nuclear file's here and everything else we're free to do. In the region, everything else. Our position should be exactly the same. Okay, the nuclear file's there and we're free to do whatever is necessary to counter you. Now, my own approach, which they're hearing, and again, I'm hearing from some of the people I talk to that these are the kind of things I have in mind. We haven't seen it yet, but I will say it's a different way of creating the kind of regional structure that Mark was talking about. And the interesting thing is we already have the framework for it in Central Command, because Israel's part of Central Command, the Arab states are part of Central Command. Here you have a built-in umbrella to do all sorts of relevant military planning. You have the ability to do something that we haven't done up until now. And by the way, the GCC states in the past did not want to do. We always wanted to have an regional integrated air and missile defense. I can tell you, I was in discussions back in 2009. John Allen and I, early in the Obama administration, were making the case that we should integrate the GCC air and missile defenses, the states at that time all wanted strictly a bilateral relationship with us. The reality is we've sold lots of Patriots, we've sold THAADs, and on our own, we don't have a whole lot to provide, but the numbers that are out there immediately create a kind of very natural integrated defense if in fact you bring them all together. You make Israel part of that. You create a regional-wide early warning system on all missile launches. You create a whole new approach to defending against drones, countering drones. All this can be done within the context of Central Command. In addition, what can be done within Central Command is we can run all kinds of exercises, many of which should be rehearsing. We should be telling the Iranians that if, in fact, you even think about violating the commitment you make in the JCPOA, which is not to seek, acquire, develop a nuclear weapon, we will take out your entire nuclear infrastructure. And we should be running exercises that demonstrate we're preparing for that. They will see that. The point is, we should be doing things in the region. And I'll just tell you, we will have to. Because the one thing we know without absolute certainty is not just because we've seen it before, we know the supreme leader will want to validate his ideology after this deal is done. We know for sure because we saw it before. They will increase, this is what Amjad was saying, they will increase what they're doing in the region. And they will have the means to do so. That's the meaning of sanctions relief. Now, I think the administration understands that. I think there's a potential for a new approach precisely because I think there's been a wake-up call given what the Russians have done. And that wake-up call is not just for Europe, it's for elsewhere. I know that Mark said, look, we want to focus on the Russians and Chinese. I think there's more of a recognition that we can't leave the Middle East out of this. Now, whether that is only a concept and it can be, and they're prepared to take the actions that allow us to implement that concept, I don't know yet. But my view at this point is this really is a kind of turning point in a lot of respects. What I listened to Amjad say, regrettably, is not new to me. I've been hearing this frequently. By the way, you know, I literally returned from Israel this morning. And all I can say is that the talking points that you hear there are the same as the talking points you hear throughout the region. There is a recognition that more has to be done on their own. There still is an understanding that you need the United States. And the United States needs to play the role. And the critical question is the Biden administration, is it prepared to play that role? I'll just conclude by saying this. Mark said something that was very important that I think reflects what the administration wants, which is that you get the regional countries, just like we're seeing now in Europe, to assume greater responsibility so that we have to do less. But here's the key. They will assume greater responsibility on their own because they don't have a choice. On the other hand, if they have to hedge their bets, they'll do that as well. If we want them to adopt a strategy that fulfills what our collective interests suggest, they have to see we're prepared to be there in the crunch for them. None of them is going to go out on a limb if they think if they go out there, we're going to chop it off. So part of what has to happen now is a posture in the Middle East that reflects we are doing things differently, very differently from after the Obama administration, when they did turn a blind eye to what the Iranians did because they were afraid this would jeopardize the deal. The Biden administration has to demonstrate now that it's different. I hear them say to me that they are different. The proof, as we like to say, is in the pudding.
Let's be then come back to you, Amjad, and for the region. Just beforehand, we'll just remind again for those who wants to ask a question, you can do so on the chat or raise your virtual hand, which I think you can do as well, and we'll address it. So, Amjad, the Israeli defense minister just a few weeks ago had a visit to Bahrain. Again, the type of things that would have been very difficult to imagine just a year and a half ago. Security concern is the name of the game. Iran is the name of the game, and perhaps it follows what you've mentioned before. the absence of American action requires and necessitates a regional action. What Ambassador Ross was referring to, a joint comprehensive security plan for the region, if it's not a joint comprehensive plan of action for the Iran deal. Is that something that you begin to see in the region? And how do you assess the recent moves?
Mm-hmm. If I may say, if there is one voice at this point, there is agreement, I think, at least a mutual agreement, but it's not been written, virtual, let's say, in that sense, between Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Tel Aviv, when it comes that they all have one common threat and enemy at this stage, which is the Iranians. And with all respect, what Dennis spoke about is really important. And the fact that, yes, during Obama administration, or even during Biden administration, or by the way, even during Trump administration, when Aramco, the oil infrastructure of Saudi Arabia was attacked by the Iranian-led militias, or the Iranian directly or indirectly, there was not much of an action apart from condemnation. Yes, we have a lot of exercises in the region. There is a lot of exercises. There is a lot of mutual agreements on security and so on. But when it comes to action, statements of condemnation, that's all we have seen so far. But does the region requires more? Yes, and this is the reason why, as I say, every time administration comes and goes, and then we put hopes for this administration, the next administration to come, that they will approach differently. But what we see so far, there is a close relationship, or giving Iran every time what they need in their plates, while we still have seen administration of Biden and others are busy with who is doing what in Saudi streets, rather than the Iranian street. When the Iranian went on protesting, when the Iraqi people, they went protesting, there was no voice for them, even though the militia stopped killing them and so on. But when there is someone sneezing right in the Saudi or in Bahrain, Manama, anywhere, we see a condemnation, a big condemnation statement that comes from Biden administration, as if there is a revolution or a rebellion or so on. This is the kind of voice we hear. Yes, I am very passionate about this word, because we heard so many words, we had so many condemnation. But when it comes to the security of ours, let me give you a simple example of that. When Saudi Arabia was attacked, the oil prices were affected. When Abu Dhabi was attacked, we had people who were killed, right, by those rockets. But we didn't see administration from Biden saying, oh, we blame Iran for it. But when the oil prices went up in the United States of America because of Ukraine crisis, we heard Biden clearly says it, it's Putin's fault. This is the kind of voice we want to hear. It's Iran's fault, and it's Iran's fault. And the way you deal with Iran, not just making a deal, make a deal. We are not against a deal. We are with a deal. We are with a deal, but we want a good deal that includes everything. It doesn't dismiss things and then allows Iran to behave in such a way, aggressive way. And believe it or not, clock is ticking. Once the agreement is signed, watch Iran a week. Not more than a week. This is, we're speaking through history with Iran. We're speaking through regimes, one to another. The Iranian regime, it has changed its foreign policy, certain foreign policy, but the Iranian army still exists and is behaving exactly in the same way. In Shah time, they occupied the 3 islands. And when it comes to the minorities, they were still being persecuted. And in the current regime, the minorities are being persecuted, and the Iranians are still behaving in such a way, in a disgusting way, when it comes to Syria. When it comes to, the question is this. I'll end up with this. Does the peace or this comprehensive, joint comprehensive plan, will that bring peace to Israel? Will that bring peace to the people of Iraq? Will that bring peace to the people who live under the under Gaza Authority, under the militias, Hamas militias who are backed by the Iranians? Will that send any good signal to them? No, in fact, I tell you what you're going to see on the street of Gaza. Those people who've been launching rockets on the children of Israel, they will be celebrating the second day that they made victory over Biden, and Biden gave them exactly what they wanted. Sorry, we hear this. It's a bit of emotion, but it has a lot of logic.
Well, thank you for this, Amjad. I can certainly tell you that from Israel, where I'm currently at, you certainly hear these voices, and certainly also feel the actual confrontation and war that is actually taking place with Iran, mainly on the Syrian and the Lebanese arena. But Mark, let me, with your permission, get back to Russia. Certainly, we need to speak a little bit more about that before our time ends. We sometimes forget that the P5+1, Russia is certainly there, and I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that so far Russia did not make too many sounds of opposition when it came to the JCPOA until fairly recently, when it was somewhat perhaps responsible for part of the turn we just discussed. Russia has somewhat complex relationships with Iran. They have been allies in Syria. On the one hand, on the other hand, Russia has been pushing them a little bit, making sure that they are useful, at least to the degree of the Russian interests. And now Russia is a very different player. Can you speak more about the Russian calculus here? And if you think that the changing dynamics right now with Russia and Ukraine may provide the needed push to reassess some of this also from the American side?
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that the Russians do not want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. I believe that. I think the Russians have been sincere in their commitment to that. But there's also no doubt that the Russians want the Islamic Republic of Iran to be an adversary to the United States. And they played a major role both in the JCPOA and in these negotiations. And in fact, Putin's man in Vienna, Ulyanov, was bragging. There's quite an interesting video clip of him going around social media, which you can take a look at, bragging about how he and the Chinese ambassador were instrumental in helping Iran get a very good deal for Tehran. A very good deal has the flaws that we've talked about. It allows Iran to be a regional powerhouse. It allows Iran to have an economy that can sustain and deflect against US and European pressure. By the way, it also is a good deal, and that's why the Russians are asking for it, is that it can provide Iranian channels for Russian sanctions busting, right? So this is not just Russian-Iranian normal commercial trade. It's not even just Russian-Iranian arms and missile trade. It's that now that the Russians are under huge sanctions pressure, they're going to be looking for other sanctions busting channels. And you know, no one has more experience than the Iranians in busting sanctions. And in fact, because this deal is going to lift the vast majority of sanctions, Iranian banks will be back on SWIFT. Most of the sanctions will be lifted on those financial institutions. The energy sector will open up, the auto sector, mining, minerals. Most of the sanctions designations are going to be lifted as part of the Biden administration's deal. The Iranians are going to plug back into the global financial system and into the global economy. Well, great for the Russians, because now the Russians can use those channels to get around the US and European sanctions that are being imposed on them. So it's a big bonanza for the Russians, right? And then, as I mentioned earlier, it's billions of dollars of military and missile sales, and it's really again creating within the Middle East a country that is going to be not wholly dependent on Russia, because the Iranians are going to play their game and they're going to play the Russians against the Chinese, and certainly they're going to want to be somewhat of an independent actor. But at the end of the day, the two major powerhouses in the Middle East, if the Americans are not willing to commit to staying there and projecting power, will be China and Russia. And so that the Iranians are going to still depend on the Chinese and Russians for great power cover. And so what we're left with is a Middle East with great power competition, where on the adversarial side, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians will be countering us. And then the real question is going to be what we've all talked about on this Zoom call, is what's on the other side? Is it just going to be the Israelis, the Bahrainis, the Emiratis, and the Saudis, and perhaps the Jordanians and Egyptians, trying to act together, but essentially having to hang alone? Or is the United States going to be very committed to doing what Dennis described? And look, I wish I was as optimistic as Dennis. Dennis has a lot more experience in power politics than I do. But I feel like what I've seen from the Biden administration so far on multiple files, on Afghanistan, on Russia and Ukraine itself, and certainly on Iran, to me demonstrates that this team is not interested in true power politics. It's not interested in the credible threat or the application of all instruments of American power. I'll leave you with this, Nir, because I think it's a very important insight both into Iranian thinking and American thinking. Most of Iran's nuclear escalation after Trump withdrew from the deal occurred after the election of Joe Biden, right? So after the president withdrew from the deal in the middle of 2018, the Iranians waited 1 year before they began to escalate their nuclear program. They began that escalation incrementally. And then Joe Biden was elected, and Joe Biden made it very clear, I was going back into this deal. I thought my predecessor's maximum pressure campaign was wrong-headed, and I'm going to be looking for engagement, which ultimately will lead to sanctions relief. Well, the message to Tehran was this administration could be blackmailed. And then what the Iranians did is they began to escalate their nuclear program after Biden was elected. And they went to 20%, they went to 60%, they began installing advanced centrifuges, and they began to take breakout time to about 3 weeks. That happened because Iran perceived American weakness. Now, the only thing we know about the Iranians, and I'll end with this, is when the Iranians push forward and they feel American mush, they continue to push. When they run up against American steel, they back down. And that is the history of the Islamic Republic since 1979. So when they feel steel, and it has to be American steel, they're going to back down. Now, the interesting thing is the Israelis, right, a country near, dear to your heart, 10 million people, tiny air force, talented but tiny intelligence community, has been running circles around the Iranians in Syria, but also inside Iran, according to press reports. And if Israel, a country that small, can project power against Iran, by the way, with limited Iranian retaliation, because I think at the end of the day, the Iranians are starting to get very paranoid about Mossad and 8200's capabilities, then what can you imagine the United States could do with our capabilities if we had the will to use even some of those capabilities? So I hope Dennis was right. I hope the Biden administration will pivot from a fatally flawed nuclear deal to trying to counter Iran in the region using other instruments of American power. But I remain skeptical that we're going to see that in the next couple of years.
Well, you remain skeptical, but Ambassador Ross is doomed to succeed, as written is one of his books. So, Dennis, when you're looking at 2 decades now of American policy, and when you're looking at the trajectory from leading from behind until making America great again, and you go through the different arenas, whether it's Syria, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's the Kurds, I mean, you've seen America withdraw from the Middle East. And now we've also seen an American will to make a deal that has now been perhaps circumvented due to other circumstances. And now you see Ukraine, who is, if you were to take for a second an interesting comparison to Afghanistan, you see people who are really, really fighting despite of the fact that they've received perhaps less support and training in compared to others. Is any of this going to you think bring to a pivot, or is the message to the region still is, and that's what it should be, that America should stay behind and the region should do what it needs to do in order to lead?
Look, obviously there needs to be a kind of balance, but let me offer more of a historical perspective. It is not unusual for the United States to go through periods where you see a wild swing of the pendulum. So before, Woodrow Wilson brought us into World War I to play a role that we had not played before. And it was kind of a moral binge. And then there was a reaction to it in the aftermath. And we saw an American withdrawal. We saw the emergence of American first slogans in the 1930s. And ultimately, it's the Nazis in World War II which brought us out of that. After World War II, we assumed a set of responsibilities we had never, ever had before, including, most specifically, a responsibility to others. If you go back to George Washington's farewell address, he actually didn't use the language entangling alliances. That was Thomas Jefferson who used that language. He used the language, no permanent alliances. Our posture was one of neutrality, basically through up until World War I, and even in World War I, it takes time for us to go in, and then Wilson has this idea that he's going to remake the world. But it seemed to fail, and the cost ends up being very high. And we retreat, we withdraw. We come out of that because of World War II. We assume responsibilities we'd never assumed before. You go up to Vietnam. Vietnam produces the same kind of retrenchment, withdrawal on our part. And it takes, in a lot of ways, Ronald Reagan brings us partway out of it, not completely. It's actually the first Gulf War that is transformative in that regard. In fact, it's Colin Powell says, we kicked the Vietnam syndrome. Now we're dealing with the effect of the quote forever wars, where a lot of the American elite were seen as being responsible for wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that were highly costly, seemed to produce nothing but pain, cost an enormous amount of money, and in a sense discredited much of the elite with part of the American public. I think Russia has just provided one of these shocking events that brings the US back into focus. Look, I think a critical two words that Mark used are critical here. He referred to power politics. This administration, for reasons that honestly I never understood, seemed to be way too sensitive to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, who tend to view the world through a lens where it's the US that's responsible for all the problems. If we just weren't out there, if we just withdrew our presence and our forces, there'd be no problems in the world. Well, I think there's a wake-up call that power politics matter, and the US has to play them. And if we don't, we're going to be seeing more examples of what this administration, to its credit, has now mobilized much of the world, and certainly the Europeans, to adopt a set of policies that no one anticipated, including especially Vladimir Putin, thought he would face. Yes, he underestimated his own capabilities. I mean, he exaggerated his own capabilities. He underestimated the Ukrainians. He was convinced there'd be minimal blowback. He thought the $630 billion he had in reserves gave him a cushion. Turns out he didn't realize that a lot of those monies are now in frozen accounts and he can't gain access to them. The point is, power politics have demonstrated that there is a need for the US to play in them. Now, it may well be, maybe we should get together again in 6 or 9 months and we can take stock. And it could be that my optimism reflects wishful thinking and Mark's pessimism reflects reality. Or maybe there's something in between the two of us. But I think the key is going to be for Amjad. I'll be very interested actually to hear from you. As you watch what the US does, will you see particular steps that you think will signal you that there's been a change? In a lot of ways, if you're the one who's impressed, that's going to count for a lot. By the way, we started with the discussion of what was a Wall Street Journal article saying the President Biden's calls weren't taken. It's a little bit more complicated than that. You now have the Secretary of State who's going to come to the region. There was a follow-up call between the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister yesterday. There was an issue I know for a fact in the UAE case that they were asking not to do the call, but to reschedule it, not to deflect it. In the case of the UAE and in the case of Saudis, they didn't just talk to Putin, they talked to both Putin and Zelensky as part of this kind of effort to see what could be done. Anyway, my point is,
it was just sending a message to the Biden administration. However, the voicemail and text message are still available.
I accept that, but I also think they're not about to walk away from the United States. And you and I both know they're not about to walk away from the United States. But now it's up to the United States to prove that the relationship is something that matters to both of us. And I agree, the idea that you're going to call up the Saudis when you need them, but otherwise you're going to only berate them. Relationships don't work that way. Anyway, as I said, I will be very interested to see if there are steps that you're convinced by, because in a lot of ways, you'll be the best measure of it.
Well, Amjad, we are just about out of time, but do you want to quickly respond to this?
Absolutely. I think Dennis is right in many things that he said. So did Mark, made a really great input. And I think if we have audience have any questions, it would be great to hear their perspective and point of views.
Well, my friends, thank you to Ambassador Ross, to Mark Dubowitz, to Amjad. I just remembered that Mikhail Gorbachev, toward the end of the fall of the Soviet Union, he said, when he was asked why he acted in a certain way, he says, the one who's late is going to be punished by life. And there's some, I think, points and moments in history when you realize that reality knocks on the door, and sometimes it's a time for action, it's a time for a pivot. And of course, no action is also an action. That's certainly a signal, and I think we've seen some of that. And I think we're getting to a very interesting point in the trajectory of the ever interesting region and American foreign policy, that it's a time for a number of decisions and actions. But with this, I think there are a number of other sessions here that I don't want to miss. So I will tell all of you, thank you very much. And I'm sure this discussion will be continued. So again, have a very pleasant morning or evening wherever you are, and hope to see you in one way or another, virtually or even for real soon.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Everybody.